First of all, I want to thank you on behalf of all the leaders we have in the room, our more than 18,000 members statewide, and certainly the 6.5 million students in California. Thank you for your commitment to public education and your willingness to take a risk and run for public office.
Thank you. You all do the work and appreciate the work you're doing every day, and also appreciate the folks that are, particularly folks up north that are impacted by the fires right now. I know it's a challenging time, and appreciate the extra energy and effort people are giving to help a hand in Santa Rosa and Sonoma and Napa and otherwise. So for folks that are up in that area, thanks so much for what you're doing and the help you're trying to do.
So members that are here, we're going to be using something called Today's Meet. You all have a link that's on your table. We've got 2 different rooms, so you're going to be using the one that says Marshall Tuck. And what we'd like you to do is we'd like you, there's 140 characters, just like a tweet. So we're going to suggest that you put in your name and your region, and then put the question in right below that. So if you need to hit enter and then hit submit the question, that would be great. You're going to need to keep that concise. And clearly trying to multitask up here is going to be a little challenging. So what I've done is I've got the ACSA staff, they're going to be vetting all the questions, and they'll find some key ones and they'll send them up. So all of your questions will be reviewed, and then afterward we'll take all the questions and we'll send them to you and give you an opportunity to respond to any others.
Right.
Okay? So first of all, many people argue that the Superintendent of Public Instruction doesn't have much constitutional authority. How would you use this office in a different way than your predecessors?
Yeah, I think the key there is a different way. So, I think about authority much more through influence, right? So we've all done the work in schools for a long time, and the reality is that a lot of the work when you're working with principals or teachers or otherwise, it's about how do you actually bring people along and influence them in addition to the actual authority that you have. So when I think about the state superintendent's role, first and foremost, it's the only elected position that's job is to advocate for educators every single day. And I think that that's something that has not happened for a long time because we don't have educators that are actually in this position. Far too often it's been folks who maybe worked in education at one point, but have been politicians for an extended period of time. So if you look constitutionally, it's the job that's supposed to be advocating for students, parents, and educators on how do we actually change the policy agenda in Sacramento. So for me, step one is I see a lot of my job to push the legislature and the governor to actually prioritize public education in this state, because it has not been prioritized for many decades. If you really look at our funding, if you look at the supports we provided to our educators and to our kids, we have not prioritized education. So that to me is a big piece of work which you don't have direct power over, but you have influence. Where you do have real authority is with the California Department of Education. And this has real impact, I think, for a lot of you. I was just catching up with a friend of mine and said, how's the work going? And they said, well, the kids are great and the policies are challenging, right? And so I see a big shift that needs to happen at the California Department of Education. That is, how do we shift the CDE to be focused on serving and supporting districts rather than on compliance and regulation. And that's an area where you have a lot of authority. So people think politics as just like policy. They don't think about the CDE as a 2,000 person, $350 million budget, whose job is to actually help support you in carrying out regulations, whose job when I am there is going to be to help you get waivers from regulations so you have more flexibility to educate your principals and your teachers. I've led 2 different school systems over the last 15 years, and particularly the Partnership for Los Angeles Schools, which were district schools in LA, where I basically led a group, kind of a district within LA Unified, 15,000 kids, just focused on turning around the lowest performing schools in Los Angeles. It became clear to me that the CDE, that the state superintendent, and frankly a lot of politicians in Sacramento, made the jobs of our principals and teachers harder rather than easier. And it actually made my job and our assistant superintendent's jobs harder rather than easier. And that's a fundamental shift that I plan on bringing to Sacramento.
You just talked about charter schools, and it's no secret that one of the most important questions that I think comes up from our members and in other locations is, your position and your relationship with charter schools in California. So what do you want to tell our members about public charter schools?
Yeah, so first thing I just want to make sure folks know my record. So the Partnership for LA Schools, which I mentioned, were district schools. So I've spent the majority of my career in district schools, not in charters. I started in charters and worked in charters for a little over 4 years. But the largest school system I led was a unique relationship between the mayor of LA and the school district, where basically the superintendent of the district said, let's create a new district within LA Unified and have it be run by a nonprofit, which I led. So I was essentially like a superintendent of a 15,000 kid district, but all district schools, so that wasn't charters. I did start my career at Greendale Public Schools, which is a nonprofit charter entity based in LA, one of the only unionized charter organizations. And so I think what you see in me is somebody who's actually led a charter school system and also a district system. And so I'm actually uniquely positioned to identify what are some of the benefits of charters, but also what are some of the unintended consequences. Ultimately, when I think about it, the reason that I did work in charters, and I still think that they are a net positive for kids, is I think of Shirley Ford, who's a good friend of mine, who I met in 2002. And Shirley Ford's son, Robert, was in 8th grade, and he was set to go to Inglewood High School. At the time, Inglewood High School had a 4% proficiency rate. It had a lot of violence on campus, and she was scared. She was really scared about sending her son Robert there. And she did not have the money to move to Redondo Beach for better public school. She certainly didn't have the money to go to a private school, so Shirley ended up sending Robert to a charter school which we had opened, Onimo Inglewood, and she really believed it saved Robert's life. And I'm not saying that was, as a school that had a strong principal, strong teachers, did the stuff that we all know works in schools, but the idea of, for our neediest families who have been stuck in low performing schools for decades, I think having another public school opportunity that's regulated by a district is a good thing. Now, I also believe the state needs to be more serious about how does it actually regulate charters. So low-performing charters should be shut down. And I know for a lot of you who work in districts, you know that even if it's not performing well, the pressure from parents not to shut it down comes, and that's why I think the state SUB can play a more active role. I think that we should ban for-profit charters, just pass a law to ban it, so there's no question there. And then I think as a collective system, we have to think about one public school system that may have some charters, but the vast, vast majority of kids are in district public schools, which is why I went to district public schools, which is why I worked in district public schools for the majority of my career. And then how do we look at other examples, places like Denver, where they have a much more integrated system around district schools and a smaller number of charters, and some of the issues you see like special education ratios, issues like charters not taking kids during the school year, they've actually addressed those issues with policy. So it's not just like a either or bad good, it's if there are unintended consequences, let's address those with policy so everyone is on the same playing field. The last thing I'll say, which is certainly I saw when I was leading the partnership, and I know you guys all feel every day, our district public schools are way too constrained by certain aspects of the education code. And what I want to do as state superintendent is work with you all and say, what are the waivers that you need locally to allow your assistant soups and allow you all and to allow your principals and teachers to do their jobs more effectively, more creativity on curriculum, more creativity on school design. Those are some of the areas where district schools should have more flexibility. It doesn't make sense that some charters do and district schools don't. And so that's the stuff that I want to work with you all on, and we'd sit down and say, how do we actually make it all work for our kids first and foremost, but as we know, our educators are the ones that are touching our kids, so it's got to work for educators too.
Sure. You ran 4 years ago. You ran a really successful campaign, but you came up a little bit short. And so what I really want to know is what you learned since then, what you learned from that experience, and how it is changing the way that you're looking at the office now. Like, why would you run again?
So it's, my wife asks me that question every single day, as she doesn't see me very often. I start with why I ran in the first place. It was particularly working in the schools in LA, where I became absolutely convinced that without changing the politics of education, because that's where the majority of the money comes from, and that's where most of the rules come from, we would never educate all kids. Because we had way too many educators working way too hard, and they were so constrained on success. For example, Griffith Joyner Elementary School in the heart of Watts, 90% of the kids at Griffith Joyner were coming from Jordan Down housing projects. And there's no way that 10 grand a kid would allow us to both educate them in terms of supporting our teachers and also have the social, emotional, and the psychological services they need. So there just was not enough money to educate every single kid at Griffith Joyner. And then April Ramos, who's a principal at Sunrise Elementary in East LA, she said, Marshall, I'm wasting 20 hours a week on bureaucracy, on paperwork, not on helping my teachers get better, not on building a relationship with my parents and my kids. And she said, this just has to change. And so that's where I said we have to change the politics of education, and decided to run in 2014. As you mentioned, I came up short, and so kind of came back and thought about what have I learned from that election, and then what do we do going forward. I first had to decide, do I run again? Do I go back and lead a school district? Doing kind of turnaround work in large districts is something that I've done before and I'm good at, or do I stick with the politics of education? And I decided that if we don't change the funding, if we don't change the rules, if we don't better support our educators, we're all just gonna be working too hard and not getting the job done for all kids. So we gotta change the politics of education. And then in terms of electorally, I want to make sure, I want to spend more time out in the field, getting to kind of a lot more listening and learning from different aspects, different parts of the state that I didn't have as much time to last time around. So for example, I was on the phone yesterday with, did a video call with Chris Hartley, who's the county superintendent up in Humboldt County, and was able to hear from him like the unique needs of his district, which is real rural, and he's got a 20% special education population, and he felt a lot of that was because there's this huge substance abuse up in his areas. He has very unique needs in terms of transportation, very unique needs in terms of technology, very unique needs in terms of teacher credentialing, given the difficulty. Like we all have a teacher shortage, and it's deep and rural. So then kind of making sure that we're touching more parts of the state to get more feedback about what's going on more broadly, and then also just trying to really make sure that people get to know me and who I am. I think unfortunately in a campaign, you're often characterized by 30-second commercials, particularly in a state of California, and the commercials had very little to do with my actual record. A person who's been an educator for over 16 years, who've worked in our toughest communities the vast majority of time in district public schools. So we're just working hard to get the word out. And then lastly, and because you asked, it's a political question too, making sure we don't run out of money. I don't mean that, I wish it wasn't the case. I joke around with folks, I like doing the work. I don't like talking about doing the work. And I also don't like the fact that in this state you have to raise money to communicate. But the reality is last time when I ran, there was some very, very, very large and well-funded interests. CTA spent $12 million against my election. And the end result was we had about $4 million less than the other people. And they spent more money saying things that weren't exactly true about my background. But the last thing I'll say is, still as convinced as always and more so every day about what's possible. There's so many wonderful educators working hard, and we all know, because we've done the work for a long time, when we step up for our kids, if our state prioritizes education, funds it well, supports our educators well, gives us more flexibility to innovate and do our jobs and be creative, then we can do our jobs in schools, and our kids will step up in a huge way. So my energy and passion for improvement is huge, and unfortunately, in spite of all of our hard work, and we are working hard, but the state and our Sacramento politicians have not made it. They have not given us a chance to be successful. Like we still need big, real change. And Sacramento is not. It's just not prioritizing our kids. It's not prioritizing our educators. And we need a voice up there, not just another politician, but a voice that actually has led schools, that knows what really has to change at a granular level, and is going to ensure that the voices of you all are actually ones that are not just an afterthought at a political table, but are the anchor point that's driving the policy agenda for the state. Educators should be driving it.
You've talked a lot about funding, so let's dive a little deeper, because I know that as I look around this room, there are very different perspectives on LCFF, the local control funding formula. I'm curious how you think that it's going, and if there are any changes that you see need to be made, especially as you're talking to superintendents and principals around the state.
Yeah, absolutely. So a couple thoughts. Conceptually with LCFF, I'm a big supporter of the concept. I was glad that it passed. So I have a son who's 6. He goes to Beethoven Elementary and LA Unified Public School. My wife and I both are graduate school. We both went to graduate school. He's cheaper to educate than our students that I served in Watts and South LA and East LA. That's just a reality. So the idea of actually giving more funding to our higher poverty kids and to our foster kids and EL students is a very good thing. I think we have to actually do more differentiation as we think about the future. So I mentioned rural earlier, special education. There are other areas, our African American males, there are other areas we have to think more about differentiating other subgroups of populations that haven't been identified, and making those changes. I think the challenge is for some districts though, because our funding is so low as a state, that our kind of middle class districts are really in a tough place, because the wealthier districts still have many, our basic aid, which no one ever talks about, right? We have districts that are actually high funded districts in the state, because they're basic aid, or they have like strong nonprofit foundations like Manhattan Beach, which has a $10 million endowment, which is right down the way. And then the high poverty actually are getting additional dollars. It's kind of, you're seeing this squeeze in the middle. So we have to get the base funding rates up. We just have to, otherwise our middle class districts just are not going to be able to truly serve all kids, and in many ways are taking a step backwards, because we talk a lot about Prop 30 and Prop 55, and I was a strong supporter of them, but they got us back to even, and last time I checked, even was 41st in the country, right? So that doesn't work, and so the base funding's got to adjust. And the last thing I'll say is the LCAP process, which is attached to it, and this is where I think having folks that have done the work in Sacramento rather than those that just think about it is critical, because on paper, LCAP makes a lot of sense. But as I've talked to a lot of superintendents, if I know from my past, if all of a sudden you wake up and you're having to write another 150-page plan with 8 different metrics, and you're forcing your staff that wants to prioritize on 1 or 2 or 3 things, which we know you should do when you're doing improvement, to say, okay, what do we do on 8 things? Then you wake up and all of a sudden the LCAP is kind of the categoricals in the back end, right? And so I think we got to be really careful about ensuring that that we're implementing this well. Now we're only in year 4, so we've all done this work. It's hard work. It takes time. I talk to the public about a 10-year plan, and my political consultant's like, you can never say 10 years. That's crazy. And I said, we've neglected our schools for a long time. It's going to take 10 years. So we're early in it, so we certainly need to adjust it and make changes to it, and that's what I plan on doing. And I think what's important, what I look for with you all is I'm not going to go up there and say, what do I want to do to change that? We're going to sit down and figure out from folks in the field what is working and what is not, and then how do we make sure that our members of the legislature and the governor know that, and also how do we build a little more energy and power with editorial boards, with some marketing to the public, so that we're not just asking them for changes, but we're actually both educating and also pushing to make sure our kids and our educators are actually prioritizing the policy decisions.
So I think by a show of hands in the room, how many of you are concerned with pension costs and what it's doing to the bottom line in your districts? I see some waving way over on the sides. So I'm just curious, how do you think the public pension issue can be solved?
So how it can be solved is as tough a question as I think our state has, but I think it's important that step 1 is we have to put it on the table. And this is just another example where our state is not prioritizing our kids in our schools the way it should. We have had this growing challenge on our pensions for a very long time. You all know in your districts, 2014, 9% of payroll funding for STRS and PERS. By 2019, it's going to be 19%. And that's all actually getting cut out of your program while we're not actually increasing your funding dramatically. This is a huge problem. And yet you haven't seen, like, if anybody in the state should be saying, guys, I don't know the exact answer. I know a framework, but we have to solve this problem because it's highly problematic for our kids. That should be the state superintendent. And yet you haven't seen elected officials come out and say, we have to solve this issue, because guess what? It's a really, really hard issue. But we've all worked in schools for a long time. We've been dealing with hard issues our whole careers. So to me, we have to put on the table, which is looking at everything. We've got to look at the overall, like, what are the role of taxpayers going to pay to make sure that we actually close this funding gap, and that it's not just kind of on the backs of our students in our schools. What actually, for those who are currently paying into the system, what adjustments do they have to make, and what adjustments do our retirees have to make? Everyone's going to have to do some adjustments in order to solve this problem. I have, I think, a pathway and a framework, but we need to get frankly, the most effective, comprehensive people who are experts to sit down and have an open public conversation saying we must solve the issue in the most respectful way to those that have worked and have pensions, in the most respectful way that people are working in this system, in the most respectful way to taxpayers. But guess what? We can't just close our eyes, click our heels, not deal with it, because every year we don't deal with it, your jobs get harder and harder and get close to impossible, and we're going to see just programs decreasing. And then the public, because we're not talking about it publicly, guess what the public's going to say? Well, didn't we just pass Prop 55? Shouldn't you have more programs in your school? Why is class size going up? Why actually is art and music being cut back? Like, that's what's going to happen, because we're not actually including people in the real conversation about what does it take to make California public schools the very best in the country. That should be the conversation. And it's in this state, we've actually prioritized the environment. We have prioritized healthcare. Unfortunately, we've prioritized incarceration. We have not prioritized public schools for decades, and we've had the same speeches and the same people come and go, but we're not getting it done. So that's what we have to work together and drive real change on.
Let's talk about conversations and critical conversations, because ACSA's taken a huge leadership role at the state and at the federal level with issues, like the Vergara lawsuit, probationary periods, dismissal, you name it. Just out of curiosity, these issues continue to be tackled in the legislature, but what do you see, what are your positions on these issues, and where do you see opportunities for change? Yeah,
I want to thank ACSA for what you've been doing on AB 1220. I think that the voice of superintendents, of directors, of principals, it needs to be a louder voice in the policy conversation in the state of California. And the way the dynamics have been set up, it has not been. And so I think it's really important that when you think about both the state superintendent, How are we gonna get your voice louder and more focused? Because you guys are the ones who actually deal with the complexity of these issues. And we have far too often, we have a 25-year-old staff member of a legislature member that's never actually been in a school making policy for kids that you have to actually deal with every day. So we have to shift that. So I love the fact that you've been out there. I think one of the reasons that the conversation on tenure has actually moved forward is because educators have been moving it forward. Not saying get rid of tenure, which my guess is a lot of you don't agree with. I don't think we get rid of it, but making it longer and earned, which just makes practical sense for teachers and for kids. And this is what I keep pushing with the folks at CTA on is, I'm sure a lot of you doing the same thing at the partnership, because it was so short. What we ended up doing is we had some teachers that were close after a year and a half that we said no to, because we didn't want to take that chance that we made a mistake. And so that's why I think without having more time, you're going to see more and more districts actually saying no rather than, hey, let's give that teacher another year and more support and move forward. So I think it's just been great that your voice has been going forward. On tenure, I think it needs to be longer and it needs to be more earned. And I love the fact that you've been pushing on AB 1220. And the good news is, bad news is that got stopped. And I think it's important to look at the details. On the really hard policies, find out what actually happened and where people stood. Because my policy has been very clear, which is strongly aligned with ACSA on this issue for a long time. We got another shot at this year, so I think we all got to work hard and let's keep pushing. But the more active your voice is, the better, and the public respects you. And this is the key. Like your voice is, ACSA's been doing a great job, but the voice has got to get stronger in Sacramento of educators, and that's something I want to kind of really work on. How do we get you out in the public more often? How do we get you in front of the editorial boards more often? How do we actually get you talking to the public so there's a counter voice to both our politicians and the public on some of these really hard issues that we know aren't good for our kids, but where your focus and your perspective has not been advocated for in a real way for a very long time. And that's what I plan on doing.
So I want to remind our members that are here, please do submit your questions to today's meet in the Marshall Tuck link there. Make sure to put your name and your region number. We've got a question from Sheldon Smith, and he says that being a Sacramento outsider, how would you see yourself navigating those invisible forces that sort of fuel Sacramento and California politics?
It's a good question. So another thing that I didn't mention when Lisa brought up is one thing I have done from 2014 to now is strengthen my relationships with folks in the legislature in order to actually, because whoever, I don't know if that was an former English teacher, but that was very well eloquently in terms of the shadowy back rooms of Sacramento. I think at the end of the day, our state, you have to, over time, we have to get a governor, a state superintendent, and a legislature that say that public schools are the top priority in the state of California. And not just say it, but actually back that up. Like, I believe that we need, for the next decade, public schools and our kids to be the top priority. And so part of my job is how do I actually get more effective at working with folks in the legislature, working with other folks that are interest groups in Sacramento. Steps I've taken so far, one is, as I mentioned, I've spent a lot more time between 2014 and now getting to know folks in the legislature, supporting some candidates in the legislature that I think we have a stronger base of individuals there that are more open and more independent on education and focused on improving public schools. 2, I reached out to all the governor candidates and explained to them very clearly, in my job, I plan to work with them. We've had in the past, we have like friction between a governor and a state superintendent. That is not good friction for our kids or for our teachers and principals, and so that's worked there. And then 3rd is, I've had the opportunity to spend more time with folks who are day-to-day in Sacramento. So a lot of the different groups that are actually a part of kind of the Sacramento insider world. I think there's huge benefit in being someone who isn't of Sacramento because we need to change it. But I think the question's a good one because I can't be such an outsider where you're actually not able to get anything done. And so that's why I think you've seen over the last 4 years a lot more progress from me on building relationships and understanding the actual details. And then also, guess what? That's why I leverage relationships. It's not just about me. I mean, ACSA knows Sacramento very, very, very well. So I sit down with Wes and with Edgar and with your team to think about, like, how do we move the needle on this? And how do we look at our collective relationships? I think too often it's like, this district wants a waiver here, or we're going to have this, this superintendent or this county soup pushing here. Let's collectively come together and use our kind of political acumen, our education expertise, and our confidence with the public to get meaningful change in our schools.
So I spent 4 years at a county office, and I look around the room and I see many county office folks here, and they're the ones that typically will most interact with the California Department of Education. So Michael has a question here, and his question is, how would you build internal capacity in the CDE to support districts as we grapple with the new system of accountability? Yeah, so a couple thoughts there, and I'm glad you mentioned the counties. So, for us that have done the work, like I think about how do we develop our teachers in our schools? It was teacher to teacher.
We actually found our most effective teachers, gave them time in their master schedule to go and coach and mentor their peers. How do we actually develop our principals? We had existing principals do kind of mentorship with our newer principals. We had people who were great principals go and actually be the coaches of our principals. So I really believe in a peer-to-peer model for capacity building. Okay. And this is where I think the counties can be a huge role. So I don't look to increase the size of the CDE. I look to shift the skill set, which I'll mention in a second. But what I want to do is actually, how do you give the counties more capacity to actually work with each other to build each other's capacity? So if we have a county that's just really doing a better job on special ed or has found different strategies, let's actually give them resources to lend their staff to other counties to do that side-by-side work, the same thing we do in our schools and in our school districts. Like, that's where I want to build the capacity of counties and districts to be the ones sharing and helping with each other. And you are all very busy, so if I say, hey, go and actually consult with your neighboring district, but by the way, I'm not going to give you any more money or time, it's impossible. We're already so crushed as it is. But if I give you dollars and say, hey, if you hire one more person, can you actually lend a person to go spend a couple months at a time? That to me makes sense. Second thing we're going to do in the CDE is actually have rotating positions for practitioners. So I want to go to districts and counties and say, can you lend us your CAO for a year or two? We'll pay you to actually backfill or to promote a person below that. So we have real practitioners in the CDE that are actually driving the work rather than folks that are 15, 16, 18 years removed from schools. And so creating actual roles where we have folks coming in, some full-time, but some rotating. So you're really kind of keeping a fresh focus on the field up in the CDE, right, in all the different departments. And that's something that we want to get done. The third thing on a culture shift is we're going to do surveys every year and make them public. Like, we did this a lot in our schools where we had our teachers and our classified staff and our principals do surveys about how our home office or district was actually doing. It wasn't always the easiest thing to read, particularly in the early years when it was tough. Like, I took some serious heat in some of those surveys, but you learn from it. And so I want to have the CDE actually do surveys of districts and counties, both county and districts, to actually give the CDE feedback every year. How are we doing? What areas do you want to improve on? We'll share that with everybody, and then just like we do in our schools, then we prioritize, we scaffold, and start working on each issue. So those are some ideas on how we shift this overall culture to be service and support. Lastly, if we get you more flexibility from the education code, then you're shifting some of the roles of folks in the CDE, and you want to shift those from compliance to support.
I like service and support. Thank you. Pam's got a question. Pam's question is, what's your position on Prop 13 and its impact on public school funding?
So in 1977, we were 7th in the country in per pupil funding, and today we are 41st. And what happened in 1978? Prop 13, right? So the clearest reason as to why we are so low is Prop 13. So we have to, I believe that the state needs to say, we are going to be top 20% in funding every year no matter what. Like, that has to be a commitment from the state. One of the unintended consequences of Prop 98 is that people have accepted Prop 98 as a ceiling. Once we get our Prop 98 funding, then we're done with education. And a lot of folks in the legislature, it's stunning actually when you talk with them. They actually think, oh, isn't Prop 98 mean schools are getting their funding? No, it means we are 41st in the country. So we actually have to get above there. So we have to shift the overall revenue base. And I think we need to look at Prop 13. We can look at, particularly on the corporate side, and particularly right now when the federal government's talking about actually decreasing corporate taxes, like, it's time to kind of think about how do you actually kind of fix those loopholes in Prop 13 where folks, I think where a lot of corporations have been able to kind of cheat the system a bit to get funding back into our system. And I think we also need to think about, I think in Prop 13 is it increased the difficulty of passing local parcel taxes or bonds to 2/3. So if you can build a new school at a 55% vote, but if you actually want to pass something locally to pay teachers more, it requires 2/3. That was also built into that law. That needs to change. We had to lower that threshold so local communities can actually increase revenue. We have to look at the overall revenue base. So but not just like both Prop 13, but other areas, right? Whatever it takes to actually get us to top 20%. And it's not just about taxes. It's also about prioritizing our budget. And this is where I think it's a challenge. We've had a couple decades of folks in this position that have been members of the legislature who are used to making trades, right? Okay, this for corrections, this for education. And I say, when we have so much work to do to improve, we can't just be everyone equal. Education has to be number one. So corrections budget right now, if we cut our corrections budget by a little over 10%, we could fund pre-K for all. And we all run budgets. We've run schools. We've actually run school systems. We've been in districts. It's hard, but you can cut any budget by 10%. It's just the state's choosing not to. So I think it's about how do we actually both reallocate dollars in the policy in the current budget? How do we actually look at Prop 13 and other areas to increase overall revenue? And we have to get top 20%. We have the highest poverty rates in the country. We have a very, very complex student population given the different cultures, different classes, different languages. We actually have to be amongst the best funded states if we want to have the best public schools. And I believe unacceptable to not this great state of California, all the money we have, all the intellectual capital we have, we should have the very best public schools in the country. And we can do it. It's time to start choosing to do it. And I want to work with you all to make that happen. And not just, there's been speeches upon speeches upon speeches about improving funding. Let's actually get some people up there who are going to work every single day to make it happen with some different ideas and not just the usual kind of backroom, political horse trading where education loses, frankly.
So let's talk for a second about some of those differing ideas. So Zana's question is, what ideas do you have for addressing equity within California's classrooms?
So we have had, as you all know, our achievement gap has been stuck for a very long time. And we talk a lot about equity, but we actually don't shift it. We have to shift it at an entirely, comprehensive system-wide level. So I'll just talk through experience about what did we do. So Santee High School, which is a school that the partnership served, was the lowest performing school in 2008 in LA. The lowest performing school. It had 26% four-year graduation rate. It had 3,500 students, and it had 35 of those 3,500 were grade level math. 300 were grade level in English. It was the lowest performing school in LA. And our work was turnaround work, and we always felt like turnaround was how do you take lowest 5% and get them up to the average. And so what did we do at Santee, and this is comparable in terms of what do we do at the state level. We raised more dollars. We leveraged philanthropic community to kind of fund more. You can't do philanthropic at scale statewide. You actually got to do the overall revenue base. But we actually got more dollars because our highest need kids need more money. LCFF has started that. We need to actually continue to grow that and make sure that we are actually getting more dollars to our highest poverty communities. Secondly, we actually paid our principals more to work at Santee High School. So we raised additional dollars. You can make 25 grand more to be a principal at Santee than a principal at Palisades High School, which is in a really wealthy part of LA. And we did that because we felt that it was, how do you attract incredible principals like Martine Gomez, who was the principal at Santee, to come there? You have to differentiate on the talent, right? Third is we gave our teachers much, much more professional development and professional development around how do you have not just skills, pedagogical skills, but also cultural competency, right? We had to actually add that. And so I think at an equity level, until we differentiate our people and really think about both the training, more training, and also how we get more of our highest, most effective educators to work in our most challenging schools with our high income, with our lowest income kids, then you're not going to shift the thing dramatically. We also invested a ton in parent engagement. So we ran a parent college on Saturdays once a month in Watts, in East LA and South LA, where our parents came to learn about how to get more involved in their kids' education. And it was hard, it cost money. We went door to door. We were out door to door in the projects and bringing our parents up. But we know that when parents are more involved, schools are more successful. And so we invested a lot more in that. And what I've always known, and many of you, as you all know, our parents, they love their kids. Some communities, you got to actually do more work to get them involved. So at a state level, kind of comprehensive, how do we get more funding to our schools? How do we give you all more flexibility so you can actually think about staffing differently and time differently? I think a lot of our high poverty kids need more time, particularly when they're so far behind. Pre-K for all, like equity, we will not get to equity until we actually start school earlier than age 5 and 6. We all know the achievement gap starts well before kindergarten, so we got to actually move to pre-K for all. How do we actually get kind of parents and invest and share best practices to get parents more involved? And the last thing I'll say there is, what I always love about schools, somebody in this state is doing it right now, right? Like in your districts, you have seen success in certain areas. And so I think the state's job should be, rather than compliance and regulation, find out what is working. Which districts and schools are doing the very, very best on equity? Which ones have found a way to kind of pre-K for all, actually have more experience and stability amongst your teaching staff and principal staff at your highest poverty schools, more time for our kids that are behind. Let's find it out and let's share those best practices across the state. Let's scale what we know works and let's actually leverage what you all know is working and go and drive change on it.
Marshall, I think we've got time for one more question, and I'm going to go to, it's AJB's question, and it says the media provides a very negative view of public education. So we're going to turn this and we're going to end on a positive note here. You are Superintendent of Public Education for the state of California. What are you going to do to change the public's perception of public education?
Yeah, so it's a what are we going to do? Because certainly a one person can't do it, but I really think we have to focus on, we just think about a 10-year mission in this state to move our schools from being amongst the lowest in the country to amongst the best. It is possible. And so part of that 10-year mission is we won't get there. We don't get to more funding at the level we need to unless the public is committed to our public schools. We don't get more people to want to come in the teaching profession and address our teaching shortage unless the public is excited about our public schools and believe in it. And we need to get more people to work harder for our public schools. So how do we do that? I always think about a combination of like what specific policies can you actually put in place, and then also what kind of marketing can you do in parallel. So some things like on policy, like one thing I want to do on the teacher shortage is and this is not overly expensive, it's actually in the ballpark of doable right now, is let's actually have free college for everybody who commits to be a teacher for 5 years. A policy like that says that a state actually, like you have to you can't just say let's prioritize our teachers, you have to actually take action to prioritize our teachers. So let's pass a couple $100 million, it's not impossible. And then all of a sudden, if you're 15, 16, or if you're 18, 19, like, oh, I can get no college debt, and I love, it's an awesome job, I'm gonna do that. Oh, and by the way, this is the only job our state does that for. Our state prioritizes public education. Let's actually give our school districts a lot more flexibility to innovate and do some exciting things, and then let's market those things, right? The media is always talking about how bad things are, but guess what? In 2017, there are plenty of different channels outside the newspapers, right? Let's make sure we start the process of like every district just highlighting the heck out of what's working well. Like every district have a regular once a year, twice a year sharing of what are the best practices in our district. Let's actually fund a statewide marketing campaign for public schools. So look at the military. The military, I'm a big supporter of our military. I sit on Saturdays, I'm watching TV with my little 6-year-old kid, and I see this commercial for the military, and you're like, that's real service. Let's do the same thing for education. Let's actually, for multiple years, explain to them, is there any better form of service to others than teaching? Let's actually run large-scale marketing campaigns for our educators. Let's actually run, I think once a year in every big city and every rural area, let's have a big concert, free only to educators, right? So you gotta do a combination of both kind of aggressive marketing outside of just the system. I think too often all of us that work in schools, we forget that there's more voters that do not have kids in public schools than voters that do. And so we've got to touch them. And so you kind of touch them with broader marketing, you touch them with specific policies to drive change, and then also let's actually give you all a lot more room to innovate, and let's lift up the things that are actually working. Like what are the pilot projects at a district level that are working? And let's go back to the public and say, look guys, when we actually gave pre-K to all, results went higher, let's do it for all kids if it was just in the district. Hey, when we actually pay teachers more in this district, let's do it for all kids. Hey, when we connected Health and Human Services to our schools in this county and district at a pilot, it worked, so let's go do it across the entire state. So it's a lot of work, and we have to recognize where we are, which is the public. We got to renew the promise of public education, and right now the public is not behind it the way they should be. And we need leadership that's going to do it. And I just encourage you to look at not just what people say, because there's been a lot of speeches for a long time. Look at what people have actually done. We raised $100 million from companies and individuals that had never given a dime to schools to support the lowest 5% public schools in Los Angeles. Like that is possible. How do we do it? We got our educators out there, our kids and our teachers and our principals and our superintendents. They were the ones leading the conversation. Everyone has a great experience with a teacher. Let's run a great campaign where everyone shares like how the teacher changed their life. And that's going to inspire young people to want to go into teaching. And that's going to inspire taxpayers to want to say, hey, yeah, I'll put in a little more to make sure all kids have a shot at a future. And it's not going to be easy. Like, we've done this work. It is hard work. But what I think is most important is we have to get moving in a different and much more urgent way. I don't mean moving in your day-to-day jobs. You are working as hard as you can. I'm talking about state politically. Actually committing to our public schools, actually getting people who have done the work, who aren't just politicians, actually driving the work, and use our collective skills and imagination to truly support educators, and most importantly, to actually not just say educate every single kid, but take the meaningful actions required to do it. Santee High School, as I mentioned before, 26% graduation rate, it's 81% today. It's past the district average on English. It wasn't easy, it wasn't one speech, it wasn't one piece of policy, it was a comprehensive, focused effort over a decade. You've done this in schools in your districts, let's do it statewide together, and that's what my campaign is all about, and that's what I'm all about.
Thanks, Marshall. Well, I want to again thank you on behalf of our 18,000 members. Only, a couple hundred of us here today, but we're committed to supporting strong candidates. We look forward to seeing, you advance as the two of you that are candidates head through this next campaign. I again want to thank you for your energy, for your passion, for your exciting ideas. We appreciate all of it, and we look forward to watching you.
Yeah, and I just want to thank you. I want to thank you. You guys, I think ACSA has been really, I just appreciate the leadership and courage. You guys have been out there on some tough issues, I think in a bigger way recently, and I think it's important. So I just encourage you all. It's hard in this state because we do our jobs every day, and it's exhausting. Like when you're in a job that's really hard, that's not supported, that's not respected enough, that's underfunded, it can be exhausting. You bring it every day for your kids. Like, let's keep bringing it also politically and practically for our state. And I love the work that ACSA has been doing, and look forward to working really closely with you all and with ACSA to make sure that the voice of educators is the voice driving the action for our kids in this state. And thank you for the work you're doing leading, Lisa. Appreciate it. And thank you guys for having me today.